80%. Only one agency of the federal government had potential power to regulate those, and that was the Federal Reserve. And Ned Bramlett, one of his colleagues in the Fed, told him, one, there's a bubble, and two, there's a huge problem in subprime. We need to send in the examiners. And he refused to do any of those things. You see how crippling the ideology becomes. Even when there was regulation, the head of Washington supervision during the savings and loan crisis, the guy that recommended removal of our jurisdiction over Lincoln Savings because we recommended receivership, the guy who said he knew Keating wasn't a fraud because Keating looked him right in the eye. That guy was demoted 5 levels after our congressional testimony. The same congressional testimony that led the head of the agency to resign in disgrace. Guess what? He came back. He rose back through the Office of Thrift Supervision, and after a series of blunders like this, was promoted to be the head of the entire West region, which is where all the major regulated subprime lenders were. And he finally had to resign in disgrace because he authorized one of the worst, in fact, the worst, liar's loan lender, IndyMac, to backdate documents to make it appear that it had more capital. So they take a guy who's the most infamous professional regulator in U.S. history, and they put him back in charge. Of course, the head of the agency is the clown who came to the press conference with a chainsaw, standing next to the 3 leading bank lobbyists, and poised over the federal regulations to demonstrate their intention of destroying regulation. Well, they succeeded. So A, most of the sector was left unregulated. B, to the extent it was regulated, it was desupervised. The rules were there, but no one was going to enforce them because they didn't believe in them. Why would you bribe somebody in those circumstances? Why would you spend extra money to make it harder to see that the loan application is a fraud? Right? That just cuts down your profit margin if you pay bribes that are unnecessary. So that's the horrific lesson of the current crisis. It wasn't worth bribing anybody. It wasn't necessary to bribe anyone. The ideology had so captured them that they created this environment, as we say, criminogenic, that produced an epidemic of this fraud. So the FBI ends by saying it would be irresponsible to discuss this crisis without discussing the role of fraud. Well, look at the discussions by the last administration and this administration, and you will see that they are routinely irresponsible because they ignore control fraud. Thank you.
We cannot take questions, so please step up to the microphone. Have any questions?
Following the debacle down in the States, the corruption of the down there for whenever it started, financing. And I'd like you to tell us a little more about what happened to Miss Bourne after she stood up and tried to warn everyone. I believe, from what I understand, poor woman just absolutely almost had a nervous breakdown at the end of it all. But if you could tell us a little more about what has happened to her.
Yes, and in fact, let me close the loop on the other. I told you that there was this chairman that re-regulated the industry. They started out someone who was devoted to Ronald Reagan. He is unemployed and unemployable 25 years after, but he doesn't have to avoid mirrors. Brooks Lee Bourne was squashed utterly, and it was what we now call government Goldman. It was Rubin and Summers, to some extent Geithner, but he was a minor player at that point. But it was Greenspan, it was Phil Gramm. It was a very bipartisan effort. Phil Gramm was a very conservative Republican, had one of the senior guys in Senate banking. And it was Art Levitt. That's the real tragedy. Art Levitt, who had been a reformer at the Securities and Exchange Commission, who had himself been squashed by Summers and Rubin and other things, joined them. And on the documentary, the Frontline documentary, he does a mea culpa and says, I was wrong. And so what was the bottom line? They rushed through a statute that not only said, you can't go forward with this particular regulation, but we're removing your statutory authority to regulate credit default swaps at all. And so that huge hole was left that was exploited by AIG and others.
I'd like to start by saying I'm a student here at the university and I've been studying political science. My whole dream was to be in a parliament one day, but what do you say to a student like me who is discouraged and wants to turn his back on the same politics by hearing these things? What do you say to a student?
Well, of course I say what any author says, read my book. No, seriously, my point is, the book does go through, you can make this the worst of times, you can make it the best of times. There were a number of people that stood up. Some of them in the regulatory ranks were crushed, but the people in Congress that stood up again with us were not squashed, and they went on to very good careers. And I do profile a number of them. It isn't everybody, and you shouldn't assume that if I work against the tide, it's the end of my career. It's quite the opposite in many cases.
I'm very interested in your speech. I have a website for you probably already know about. I won't even say it because people don't realize the depth, I think, of how deep this is. But I was wondering if you could comment on captured regulators, and particularly the SEC, the dog that never barks for anything. And I'm curious to know how, in your political system, you can deal with that kind of stuff. Because it obviously, if you attack something with a lot of power, it strikes back, however it wants. And, I'm sure we didn't kill people that had to, right? But basically, they buy these regulators and stuff. I don't understand where was the SEC. How are you going to deal with that? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So how do we fix the SEC? So one of my proposals, and indeed I got a little article on it, is, and it's not just applicable to the SEC, obviously, why doesn't the SEC have a chief criminologist? You look in their website, they say we're a law enforcement body. But they've got nobody that knows anything really by training about fraud mechanisms, which is what securities fraud is all about, right? So they hire accountants who a few get a course in forensic accounting, but traditionally they didn't have any. And they got lawyers, the only thing they learn is the definition of a fraud, and they get economists who learn that you can't have fraud, that the markets prevent it. So I think it's critical to change not just them, the FDIC, the other banking regulatory agency, to bring people in who actually understand these fraud mechanisms. Madoff, after all, says, I thought the SEC would catch me. They could never conceive of me as a Ponzi scheme because I had high status. And that's what we warn about, and that's what power, it's partly power, it's partly reputation. The problem is that they all link together. The wealth, the power, the reputation all build from the same thing. And then it becomes almost impossible for people at the SEC to even conceive of this guy being a crook. So people like me have no difficulty conceiving of people in nice suits being crooks.
Just one comment on power, right? There's obviously power and money and stuff, but integrity also has power, right? That's what they're afraid of. That's exactly why they fear and why they attack. Because people that tell the people like Gandhi over there and stuff, they have power too, and that's what they're
Well, there is no greater demonstration of that than, they hire private detectives twice. They spend lots of money to sue you. They put things in writing